Our opening thought is from Erich Fromm, from the work Escape from Freedom. Fromm writes, "Greed is a bottomless pit which exhausts the person in an endless effort to satisfy the need without ever reaching satisfaction." Our next reading comes from Kurt Vonnegut. Kurt Vonnegut gave one of his last public lectures at Oklahoma City University before his death many years ago. I had an opportunity to meet him. This reading comes from God Bless You, Mr. Rosewater. Thus did a handful of rapacious citizens come to control all that was worth controlling in America. Thus was the savage and stupid and entirely inappropriate and unnecessary and humorless American class system created. Honest, industrious, peaceful citizens were classed as bloodsuckers if they asked to be paid a living wage. And they saw that praise was reserved henceforth for those who devised means of getting paid enormously for committing crimes against which no laws had been passed. Thus the American dream turned belly up, turned green, bobbed to the scummy surface of cupidity unlimited, filled with gas, went bang in the noonday sun. Vonnegut had a way with words. Our next reading comes from Dan Buettner from the book The Blue Zones, 9 Lessons for Living Longer from the People Who've Lived the Longest. This section of the book comes from an interview with a woman named Kamada, who was over 100 years old. She said, "I used to be very beautiful. I had hair that came down to my waist. It took me a long time to realize that beauty is within. It comes from not worrying so much about your own problems. Sometimes you can best take care of yourself by taking care of others." So much of how we define success, how we define well-being in our society revolves around the money we make, the things we accumulate. And it's clear that this acquisition and consumption culture, where the quantity of stuff counts more than the quality of our relationships, is leading to a dead end for humanity and for all of life on earth in many ways. How can we move away from an overemphasis on acquisition, accumulation, and consumption and move towards a life of qualitative meaning and purpose? I've told some of you about my obsession with European literature in my mid-20s. Part of that obsession was related to the fact that I spent 2 years studying in Europe in different places, in Switzerland and in England and in Germany. And so part of my immersing myself into that culture was to immerse myself in some of the literature of that culture. And I read Dostoevsky and Kafka and Camus and Orwell and Tolstoy. Those were some of my favorites to read. To put it mildly, this was not light reading. These authors were addressing some of the most troubling aspects of the human condition in their writings, whether they were writing about human suffering, violence, war, religious conflict, evil, or greed. They were wrestling with the factors of human life that have contributed to horrific suffering throughout human history. During this time in my 20s, I was particularly drawn to the work of Leo Tolstoy, partly because before going to Europe, I spent 7 to 8 weeks in India, and there I was studying the thought of Mohandas Gandhi, among other things, and I learned about the influence of Tolstoy on Gandhi's thought. His views were very influential on Gandhi's thought, so that drew me to Tolstoy's writing. Started out with a real small work by Tolstoy, War and Peace. Whew, yeah, I made it through it. I made it through it. An amazing novel. I had to, it was translated in English. I was reading it in English, but I had to have an unabridged dictionary next to me while reading War and Peace to understand all the words that I had not yet encountered in my life up to that point. And then I read Anna Karenina, and then I started getting into some of the short stories of Tolstoy. And I came across a short story by Tolstoy that I know I've talked about a little bit with you before. It's a story titled, How Much Land Does a Man Need? Okay. The main character of the story was a man, so the title suffices as it's translated. How much land does a man need? It's a story about a man named Pahom. I'm going to guess that's how it's pronounced. Pahom, who is a Russian peasant who becomes, over time, consumed by greed. He's driven to accumulate as much land and wealth as possible, and he becomes obsessed about outdoing others. So he wants to accumulate more and more land, more and more wealth. And in this desire to acquire more, Pahom learns that the Bashkirs, which is a Turkic ethnic group indigenous to Russia, something I learned when reading this story, the Bashkirs were selling large amounts of land at a very low price. And Pahom was intrigued by this opportunity. He was attracted by this opportunity to get a lot more land for very little money, to acquire more stuff. But we learn in the story that there's one condition to claiming the land. It's very inexpensive, but there's one important condition that has to be met to claim the land. Pahom can only claim the amount of land that he can circumnavigate by foot between sunrise and sunset. And so he had to go basically in straight lines rather than a circle. So at sunrise, he's thinking to himself in this story, I can cover a lot of ground between sunrise and sunset. I am going to get a lot of land today. And so he sets out on the first part of his journey and walks in a straight line a very long ways. More than he probably should have, but he wanted to get as much land as he possibly could. So he walked as far as he thought he could walk before making a left turn to begin another part of the enclosure of this land that would be his. And so he walked again a very long time, trying to guess about where the middle of the day would be, so that he would give himself the same amount of time to get back to the beginning in the next two segments of this walk, to enclose as much land as possible. Probably wasn't thinking enough about the fact that he would be more tired rather than less tired in the second part of the journey, and that it was hotter and the sun was higher in the sky, so that middle part of the journey was extremely difficult, so that third segment of the walk was really difficult. And he finally got to the point where it was time to make the turn for the last segment of the walk, and he was still a long ways away from the beginning. So he picked up the pace, was going as fast as he possibly could, but he was rejoicing inside at the amount of land that he would have once he made it back to the beginning point, which was for him the finish line. And so he uses all of his strength, all of his effort to make it back to that beginning point right before the sun sets. He makes it. And he's exhausted from the journey. And he sees the sun setting, and he lunges out and plants his stake into the ground where he began, and he had done it. He had enclosed an amazing amount of land. And he dies of a heart attack. Turns out Pahom ultimately only needed the amount of land necessary for his premature burial, precipitated by his greed, by his desire for acquisition and accumulation. In the end, his quest for more diminished his life to the point of, and I'll use a word my daughter's generation loves to use, to the point of literally ending it. Now that's just a story. It's a good lesson, right? It's a good lesson. We don't need as much as we sometimes think we need. We don't need to acquire and accumulate so much that we actually risk our lives, risk our well-being, and the well-being of our families and loved ones in the process. But tragically, we continue to see many persons who have not learned from Pahom's lesson and who can't ever seem to get enough. That can't ever seem to get enough wealth, get enough power or prestige to satisfy their desires. Tragically, their greed and insatiable appetite for more than they will ever need not only diminishes the true quality of their own lives, but it also diminishes the lives of others and contributes to the suffering of the most vulnerable among us. Whatever the definition of evil is, and I'm sure there are many ways to define evil, but it most certainly includes billionaires making their money off life-destroying activities and then hoarding their wealth while the most vulnerable in the world suffer the consequences of their greed. For all of our flaws as a nation, and we know there are many, for all of those flaws, up until 2025, the United States, through U.S. aid, was playing a significant role in controlling preventable and deadly diseases and in preventing famine throughout the world. Then the most corrupt president in American history gutted U.S. aid on advice from the wealthiest man in the history of the world, putting millions of lives at risk, and tragically already leading to hundreds of thousands of unnecessary deaths. This is what greed looks like. This is what evil looks like. On our current trajectory as a species, the epitaph for humanity may one day read, although I'm aware there will be no one there to read this, but it may one day read, a few members of the species Homo sapiens refused to give up making trillions of dollars from actions that made Earth unlivable for the species as a whole and for millions of other species of life, thus precipitating a global mass extinction event. Then it might continue to say, if intelligent life evolves again and translates this message, please heed this warning. For all of the vast differences in intelligence between humans and the dinosaurs layer in the geological record will be much thicker than ours. And their demise was not of their own making because they never evolved to be so greedy that making money became more important to them than the survival of life on Earth. If it hadn't been for that comet or asteroid or whatever it was that destroyed them, who knows? They may still be with us today and we might not have been here at all. What we must come to understand, if we are to thicken our layer in the geological record, if we are to survive and perhaps even flourish as a species in the future, what we must come to understand is that expressing empathy, having empathy for others is not a problem. It is not a problem that we must overcome, but rather it is the antidote to the numerous societal and ecological ills we are currently experiencing. We do not have too much empathy, as the least empathetic among the billionaires has claimed. On the contrary, we actually have an empathy deficit, along with a corresponding deficit of love and a deficit of community. And that is where we all must come into the picture. Our love for each other, our love for humanity, our love for all life. That love calls us to cultivate empathy, to practice justice for all within beloved community. And it's something that we have to be intentional about. It's something that we have to work together on, to cultivate. And if we are intentional about doing that work of love and community together, we may not always get what we want, but we might just find we get what we need. And that is enough. That is enough. Enough for us and enough for the community of all life on earth.